All right, so this will be the recording of a lecture for chapter 3. This is covering ecosystems, asking the questions, what are they and how do they work? And in this lecture, we also talk a bit about the different types of natural cycling that occurs in ecosystems, like the nitrogen, carbon, hydrologic cycle, and a little bit about the phosphorus cycle as well. But first we start off with, how does the Earth's life support system work? So what is supporting ecosystems and their sustainability over long periods of time? It's really breaking down to 4 spherical components that interact with each other. So they support this sustainment of the Earth by cycling nutrients and energy throughout each of those components. And this involves nutrient cycling, which, if you remember earlier, we said that was one of 3 principles of sustainability. And other types of energy that cycle could be solar energy, another principle of sustainability, but transferring that energy throughout these 4 components is really important. So what are the 4 components? We've got the atmosphere. And when we're talking about the atmosphere, we're talking about 2 layers in particular. We're talking about the bottommost layer, that is the troposphere, so the air that you and me breathe, and the lowest portion of the atmosphere where weather occurs, that is the troposphere. And then one layer above that, we've got the stratosphere. And I have a diagram to show this in more detail in the next slide. But essentially with the atmosphere, we're talking about the 2 most immediate layers, the troposphere and the stratosphere. Then we have the hydrosphere. It's got that intuitive prefix hydro because it's referring to all the water. So water at or near the Earth's surface, and the physical state is pretty not arbitrary. It's independent of the state that the water is in. So we're talking here about ice, water, and water vapor. Really, any component of the immediate hydrologic cycle makes up the hydrosphere. Next, we've got the geosphere. Again, another intuitive prefix. Geo is mainly referring to rocks and minerals. And so this spherical component is composed of the hot core, the thick, rocky mantle, and the thin outer crust that we walk on. We also have the biosphere, and the biosphere is really just, yes, it's its own layer, but it encompasses whatever life is found within the other 3 spheres. And bio usually intuitively means life, right? So at least 3 of these should be pretty easy to remember. So here we've got, right, a diagram of the Earth, and we're almost taking a cross section of that to show these different components. So here, right, we've got the hydrosphere. It's pointing to liquid water, but remember this also is indicative of ice, say trapped in glaciers, or water vapor in the atmosphere, really any form of water at or near the Earth's surface. We've got the atmosphere, so the surrounding air that we're breathing in the troposphere. We've got the geosphere, we're showing the different layers. We've got the core, the mantle, and the outermost layer, which is the crust. And you can see here, we even split the crust up further, and we see how it layers up to soil, and then we've got that organic layer, usually plant matter on the top, maybe the grass that you're walking around in around your yard. So that's all part of the crust. And then, of course, we've got the biosphere, so that's the living organisms. Really, if life of any kind is paired with any of these other components, that's all referring to the biosphere. All right, so talking more about the atmosphere, we've got a diagram here that shows the different layers of the atmosphere, and if you'll remember me talking about it, I said that the troposphere and the stratosphere were the 2 layers of interest for this spherical component. So the troposphere is where the weather occurs, the limit, like the ceiling, is where weather is not occurring anymore, and that's where you've really got, there's a slight misspelling in this diagram, but the ozone layer. So the stratosphere contains the ozone layer. It's really dense in ozone molecules. And the purpose of those molecules is to absorb the high energy UV light from the sun. And it converts that UV energy into more usable form, which is heat. And the importance of the ozone layer is that it limits, in a sense, the amount of UV light that we are exposed to because it's transferring it to another form of energy. If we did not have the ozone layer, we would be exposed to a lot more UV energy than we are right now. And, UV light in excess has a lot of negative health implications. So the ozone layer in the stratosphere protects us from that component. And these other layers, the exosphere, thermosphere, and mesosphere, we, for the purpose of this class, do not need to know those layers, in case you were wondering. And something that's important to discuss with the atmosphere is the greenhouse effect. And so you may have heard this in a previous class, but the greenhouse gas effect is really what is contributing to this long-term gradual increase in the Earth's temperature. So that idea of global warming is really perpetuated by the greenhouse gas effect. But let's talk about what that is, these different steps in the diagram. So the solar energy that powers the Earth's climate from the sun, that is coming towards the Earth as shortwave radiation, shining at the Earth in the form of shortwave radiation. Now, some of that solar radiation is absorbed by the Earth's surface, right? We need that for warmth, maintaining our own life, keeping the Earth habitable, right? But some of it, not all of it, is absorbed. Some of it is reflected off by the Earth's surface. If you're ever, a good example of this is if it's hard to picture, if you've ever been walking outside in the winter and you're looking at the snow and the snow is so bright that you almost have to look away because it hurts your eyes, that's because some of that solar energy hitting that reflective snow surface is actually bouncing back. And maybe that's what's hurting your eyes. So depending on the composition of the landscape, more of that solar energy will be reflected. So some of that energy bounces off and actually goes back to space. But the energy that is absorbed by the Earth, that gets converted from that shortwave radiation, converted to heat. And heat is generally emitted as longer wave radiation. And then we've got step number 5 here. So some of the radiation escapes into space, but when that heat is emitted, we have certain types of atmospheric gases. They're called greenhouse gases, and they have an affinity for trapping heat. So these types of molecules that comprise the atmosphere, they have an affinity for this heat that may be bouncing back. And so because they're heat trapping, that's their function, over time, as human activities cause more of those gases to be released into the atmosphere, if there's more of those molecules, a higher percentage of those molecules in that atmosphere, it will gather more heat, it will trap more heat. And that is what warms the Earth's lower atmosphere and surface. And when we're talking about global warming or climate change, that gradual increase in temperature, it's because human activities are kind of exacerbating this greenhouse effect to the extreme. So essentially, what I want you to take away from this slide is that shortwave radiation coming from the sun, some of it bounces back, but other is absorbed by the Earth's surface and can contribute to this greenhouse effect when it's released as heat. All right. So now, continuing this discussion about ecosystems, we've got, if you remember from the very first lecture, we've got biotic or the living factors. So that could be, humans, wildlife, plant life. But we've also got abiotic or non-living factors. Those could be things such as soil, water, temperature, pH. We've got those living and those non-living parts of the environment. And in both cases, they can exhibit sequential levels of organization. So there's really a hierarchy to an ecosystem structure. We start out, so we're focusing on 5 of these levels: organisms, populations, communities, ecosystems, and biospheres. And there's a better diagram here on this next slide that might depict this idea in a better way. So we start at the very bottom, right? We've got the atom, which in our last lecture, we said that the atom or the element, it can't be broken down further by chemical means. So it's really a subunit, a chemical subunit, the smallest one. So we've got atoms, and those atoms combine together to create molecules. We've got a molecule example here, such as water. And then, of course, as you build upward from that, you might have different, organelles and cell structures that are created from molecules. We've got cells. Cells are the first subunit of life. And all those cells, trillions and trillions of cells at a time, then create organisms. And as this might be more intuitive, but an organism, an individual living being. But say you have a group of the same type of organism. So we've got, say, a group of individuals of the same species living in a particular geographic area. That's a population. So that's the next level up. And then once you start to merge different types of populations, so you've got different groups of species, say living again in a pretty fixed geographic range, interacting with each other, that's where you start to form an organism community. And here's the next levels where we start to throw in those abiotic factors. So if you have a community of different species interacting, you got those interacting communities, and you have the non-living environment where we're seeing that transfer of matter and energy. That's really what an ecosystem is. And then even further, you can even take that another level up. We've got biospheres. And the biosphere is the part of Earth's air, water, and soil where life is found. So when we're talking about those spherical components, right, we said the biosphere is anywhere that life is found within either the atmosphere, geosphere, or the hydrosphere. And we've got that depicted here, right? It's parts of the Earth's air, water, and soil where life is found. And ecology, which, if you remember, ecology was focusing specifically on the study of organisms and ecosystems with each other. So ecology focuses on the top 5 levels in this diagram. So while cells, molecules, and atoms are obviously very critical components of building up these other things, ecology is really focusing more at the macro level and less at the micro or the chemical level. All right, so zeroing in now on more components of an ecosystem, we're going to talk about some different types of organisms and what their role is in nutrient cycling or even obtaining their own food. So if we're talking about an organism that is able to produce their own nutrition, they don't need to go out and scavenge, they don't need to gather food, they don't hunt, they just produce their own food. The top example of this would be plants. Plants carry out photosynthesis, they produce glucose and oxygen, they are able to self-sustain by carrying out this process. They are called autotrophs. If you need some type of trick to remember autotroph, just think autotroph means they automatically make their own food. They don't need to go gather other components of the environment to get there. The next is that if an organism satisfies nutritional requirements by consuming another organism, they are called a heterotroph. And that's most wildlife, right? Most wildlife need to consume another organism in order to sustain their function. So we've got the plants, those are the autotrophs, and then we've got essentially everything else, which is the heterotroph. And some heterotrophs decompose waste and remains of organisms, and they recycle those nutrients. So they play a role in that principle of sustainability, which is nutrient cycling. And if you've ever heard of a food chain or a food web, we will talk more in detail about those later on in the presentation. But where they fall in that food chain, so which level of the food chain they are on, we also call that the trophic level. It's actually a little misspelling here. There's supposed to be an H between this P and the I. So depending on their source of nutrients, that's usually what dictates where they fall in the food chain level. So if they are a producer, meaning they produce their own nutrients, another name for that would be an autotroph, right? Like we said on the previous slide. This is basically talking about plants. They use the process of photosynthesis to make their own nutrients. Producers usually fall towards the bottom of the food chain. Next, we've got the consumers. If they're consuming other organisms for energy input, remember another name for those would be the heterotrophs. They feed on other organisms or their remains. They can be herbivores. They can be plant eaters, right? They can be carnivores, which means they eat meat. Or they could be omnivores, which means they eat both plants and meat. Usually these consumers fall above producers on the food chain. We've also got two more interesting categories. So we've got decomposers, which sometimes, right, if they're breaking down that organic matter, they're still consuming another organism for energy input, so they're still heterotrophs. Like we said, they obtain their nutrients by breaking down the remains of organisms and their wastes. And why is that important? It recycles nutrients back to the soils. You need your soils to be somewhat nutrient rich. Recycle nutrients back to water and air for reuse by producers. So decomposers play an important role by recycling that material for the plants. A lot of decomposers are bacteria and fungi. That's generally why it's so convenient for them to recycle things back into the soil, because soil is very rich in bacteria and fungi to begin with. We've also got this other category called detritivores. So they feed on detritus, which is basically dead matter. So if we think about different types of organisms that might feed on dead matter, that could be earthworms, hyenas, even something like a vulture, right? And we'll distinguish a little more what the difference between a decomposer and a detritivore is. So if we said on the previous slide, right, most decomposers are bacteria and fungi. A prime example of a fungus could be a mushroom, right? So mushrooms actually decompose because they have these underground networks called mycelium. And mycelium will release enzymes that break down organic matter in the soil. And they tend to recycle a lot of that back into the soil, but they are essentially releasing this underground network of mycelium, releasing enzymes, and they're conducting that whole nutrient cycling process right there in the soil. So mushrooms are really critical components of the ecosystem because they carry out this whole relatively discrete nutrient cycling process. So while decomposers, such as what we just showed, break down almost dead organic materials, the difference between a decomposer and a detritivore, remember we said the detritivore also feeds on dead things, like such as a millipede, an earthworm, or a termite. They're feeding on dead things. They eat dead organisms and waste. So the decomposer is feeding on the organic materials, but the detritivores are eating dead organisms. And that's the difference. Here we've got a nice diagram to show the living and the non-living components of an ecosystem working together. So we show here a rabbit breaking down, being decomposed, and returning nutrients back to the soil. Those nutrients, along with soil moisture, are taken up by producers. So plant matter uses that to grow. So here we've got an example of the tree. The tree carries out photosynthesis. So trees will capture carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, conduct photosynthesis, and release oxygen. That's why we make a big deal about trees increasing air quality. Then say we have some type of organism feeding off the plant matter, or maybe even something like a tree, like eating fruit off a tree. Those would be primary consumers. So the tree is the producer. One level above that, remember we said the consumers are usually above the producers in the food chain. The first consumer is called the primary consumer. And those are usually smaller organisms, such as a rabbit here. And then what eats the rabbit? So here we've got a fox. We've got 2 levels above the producer now. That's the secondary consumer. And the fox is eating the rabbit. And then something else, this could go on and on, right? Something's eating the fox. That would be, if it's the third consumer, we call that the tertiary consumer. But really, we're just showing here that we're depicting that the non-living and the living components are interacting together within this system, this ecosystem. And a little more detail about soil here. So if you notice here, we have the decomposing, looks like a rabbit over here. It's bringing back nutrients to the soil. Why is soil so important? So one, just a little definition, soil is a complex mixture of rock pieces and particles, mineral nutrients. So that could be nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, other minerals, also decaying organic matter. And it has usually some component of moisture to it, right? And depending on how compacted the soil is, it's got air sitting, oxygenated pockets down on the ground in the soil. And a lot of living organisms. What are the living organisms in the soil? Most likely those bacteria and fungi that we talked about before. There's an entire soil microbiome. It's extremely important in nutrient cycling, but it could also be things that are a little bigger, right? Like earthworms or other insects. It's one of Earth's most important natural capital. So the natural resource of soil provides extremely important ecosystem services, right? We depend on soil turnover and nutrient-rich soil to grow our crops. So our food source is really dependent on not exploiting this renewable resource faster than it can be renewed. And in order for rocks to weather into smaller particles and really become soil and plant matter to break down and cycle those nutrients back in the soil, that's a very slow process. So soil is a renewable resource that's renewed very slowly. And here we have another diagram that just shows the relationship between producers, consumers, and decomposers. However, the thing I want to emphasize in this diagram is that as we're moving through each step of this food chain, so as the consumer eats the producer, heat is given off. As the decomposer breaks down the consumer, heat is given off. At each phase of consumption, heat is given off. And why is that? So in the process of metabolism, so as one organism is eating another, their metabolism is undergoing the process of respiration. And respiration tends to give off heat as a metabolic byproduct. So that's even true for us, right? So when you are eating, let's say you're eating an apple, what are you really doing when you digest something? You are breaking the chemical bonds in the apple, right? Either mechanically as you're chewing, or when it gets to your stomach, you've got stomach acid or enzymes in your body that are breaking that down at a chemical level. You're breaking the chemical bonds in that apple, and as you do so, you're releasing heat. So say you eat the apple and you go for a walk, your metabolism is kind of revving up. You are giving off heat, maybe sweating, and that's the process of respiration occurring in your body. So I just want to emphasize that heat is given off at each cycle in the food chain. And that's part of the energy flow. So energy flows through ecosystems via movement between trophic levels, through food chains and food webs. And this is an excellent tie back to the second law of thermodynamics. So if you remember, we had the first law, which was that energy is not created or destroyed, right? But then we had the second law that was saying energy moves from a useful form to a less useful form, and energy is given off as heat. So, and we said that was due to entropy, right? So entropy is like disorder. And the second law also says that entropy is always increasing. Everything's always becoming more disorderly. And that's why it's important to have energy recycling. So like the cells in your body, the cells in like wildlife, right? They're not becoming too disordered. And when you're giving off heat, you're moving it from, I think I had the coffee cup example in class. You're taking that heat from a really concentrated state and you're almost diluting it as it's given off. So we're giving off heat and almost wasting it and turning it into a less usable form as we're moving from one trophic level to another in the food web. And the difference here between a food chain and a food web, the food chain is like a linear sequence of organisms, probably more simplistic, right? You're saying we've got, say, one producer, one primary consumer, one secondary consumer, and so on. Whereas a food web is a more, it's like you're taking multiple food chains and synthesizing them into this more complex network. So if we're thinking about the average ecosystem, right, we've probably got more biodiversity than stated by a simple food chain. A lot of ecosystems probably have some complex interactions happening, so it's probably more of a food web type of situation. And then we've got this pyramid of energy flow. So we've got, you know, that heat being given off at each cycle, and energy is moving from one organism to another. And I'm actually going to skip over this because I think it's a little redundant from what I just showed. So a simplified aquatic food web, this is sort of what I mean. It's not just a linear, one thing eats the other and the next, you know. A food web is showing multiple things are eating each other. And so it's not always easy to just trace back where the energy is flowing from. So that's why it's kind of, it's challenging to answer energy flow questions in the ecosystem. Because there's a lot of different interactions that could be happening, right? But nonetheless, even if it's a more complex system, we still start with things like zooplankton, phytoplankton. These phytoplankton are producers. So we're still starting with producers at the bottom and working our way up to larger and larger predators, maybe like tertiary consumers, secondary consumers, all of which have these different different organisms that they're eating. Another thing I think it's really important to emphasize is that the arrow in a food web or a food chain, the arrow will always be pointing towards what is eating the organism on the other side of the arrow. So here we've got the emperor penguin. This arrow is pointing at the emperor penguin from the squid. So whatever side the kind of the head of the arrow is on, that indicates that this penguin is eating the squid. And we actually have a question about that on the exam. So just always know that where the arrow is pointing, that's who's doing the eating. And this is a really good depiction of how much energy gets wasted as heat is given off at each trophic level. So you're really only transferring 10% of the energy up the trophic level each time there's that exchange. So if we start with the producers, or like the phytoplankton, for instance, let's say we've got 10,000 kilocalories of energy. So, and now the primary consumer, the zooplankton, it eats the phytoplankton. It's only getting 1/10 of that energy. And then we've got the perch are eating the zooplankton. Only 10% of that energy in kilocalories is getting transferred up. And then say you eat the perch. So you're only getting 10 kilocalories versus the phytoplankton have 10,000, right? So you're losing 90% of the energy as metabolic heat at each phase. So that seems pretty significant, right? This is why some people suggest that you can get more energy from eating plant matter, because you're actually getting maybe more kilocalories of energy from a more plant-based diet. Okay, the next topic that we need to discuss is the idea of gross primary productivity and net primary productivity. But to do that, we need to quickly review the reactants and products of photosynthesis and respiration. So you might have heard me saying a couple slides ago that the whole process of metabolism is basically respiration. So that means that glucose and oxygen are being consumed, right? They are on the reactant side. And what are they giving off? So what are the products of respiration? You're giving off carbon dioxide, you're giving off water. So when we think about ourselves, right, we're exhaling, we're respirating, we're exhaling carbon dioxide. So you're taking in oxygen, you're expelling carbon dioxide. Probably also have water as a common waste component in the body, right? So no matter what you eat, like you're consuming all these things, these different sugar sources, one of the common waste products is water. But photosynthesis and respiration tend to kind of cancel each other out. So humans don't conduct photosynthesis, right? But say in plants, right? Plants conduct respiration and photosynthesis. So plants start out with carbon dioxide and water, right? And that's actually what you're putting out on this side. So plants are then kind of taking that back from the atmosphere and using it to produce the glucose and oxygen, which then act as the inputs here. So photosynthesis and respiration, they're using the inputs of one process, or sorry, the outputs of one process as the input of another process. And they're just doing that over and over. So if we're thinking about the production of carbon, like if we're talking about like the production of glucose as biomass, right? Say you have a photosynthetic process and you're trying to create as much glucose, like as much carbon product as possible. You don't want all of that carbon to be taken up by a respiration process. So let's say you want to conserve as many carbon products as possible, but we know that the outputs of photosynthesis are used as the inputs for respiration. So the idea that we're going to get at next is that carbon products, there's almost a fine level of how much a system is photosynthesizing versus how much it's respirating that we need to reach that's optimal. So gross primary productivity. What does gross usually indicates everything, right? Instead of net, which net usually indicates that you've subtracted the losses, right? But gross is everything. So gross primary productivity is the rate that an ecosystem's producers, or its plant matter, right, are converting energy into biomass. And here we're probably talking about that's the glucose, right? So we're talking about the rate that we're converting energy into biomass. So then what is the net primary productivity? That's subtracting the losses of that biomass from respiration, the process of respiration. So it's the rate that producers use photosynthesis to produce and store chemical energy minus the rate at which they use energy for aerobic respiration. This might be a little confusing at first, but if we look at this equation here, we can pretty easily see the relationship. So say you took this R stands for the the energy loss of respiration if we subtract it. But if we add it here, we'll easily see that the net primary productivity plus the respiration, that would equal your gross primary productivity, right? And we've got this good diagram here to illustrate the losses. So if you get confused about this, I would highly recommend almost looking at it from the equation standpoint, and it might make more sense. So some environments have a higher net primary productivity than others, right? So meaning some environments have more energy production via photosynthesis than they have energy losses via respiration. So an example of an aquatic environment that has a low net primary productivity would be oceans. But the reason that oceans tend to have a ton of biomass isn't because of the rate, it's just because of their size. So even though they're producing biomass at a really low rate, they still have just a huge land coverage, so they end up having a lot of biomass. However, a terrestrial environment that has really high net primary productivity would be the rainforest. And if you think about all the plant matter, all the plant biodiversity in the rainforest, that almost makes sense, right? That maybe is a bit more intuitive. Net primary productivity, in a way, almost sets the cap at what type and how many organisms can survive in an ecosystem. So this could also be another reason that tropical rainforests have such high levels of wildlife biodiversity, because they provide higher biomass to serve the food chain of all these other organisms. And the only plant matter represented by net primary productivity is available as nutrients for consumers. And that kind of gets at what I just said. So the fact that the tropical rainforest has high net primary productivity, that means that it has more available nutrients for consumers. All right, now we have a couple other components here, components of nutrient cycling that we need to discuss, and how we need to discuss how human activities are impacting the cycling of nutrients. So biogeochemical cycling, which is driven by not only that shortwave radiation from the sun, right? We're also talking about how Earth's gravity is really driving the cycling of nutrients and energy through the air, the water, soils, rocks, and living organisms. So all of that together encompasses biogeochemical cycling, and it supports that principle of sustainability that we've mentioned several times now. And that's why Earth is such a sustainable system, is because we see some of these abiotic factors like the solar radiation and Earth's gravity really pushing this biogeochemical cycling forward. So just a slide to start us off here. One important cycle that we need to discuss is the hydrologic cycle. And another word, hydrologic cycle is really a fancy way to say the water cycle, right? So when you were in school, you probably learned all about the water cycle. Why is it important? It purifies and distributes the Earth's fixed supply of water. So we don't have an unlimited amount of water on Earth. We're really just having the same water recycled through this hydrologic cycle over and over again. So we also depend on solar radiation for that, right? Because as heat strikes water, right, warms it up, eventually that water is converted from the liquid to the gas physical state and is given off as evaporation. We also see that when plant matter in particular, when water gathers from the inside of a plant and kind of condenses on the leaves, we've got transpiration, because that water is then converted into gas and as water vapor in the atmosphere. So then we're looking at transpiration. So evaporation and transpiration, very important, right? Another important factor happening in the water cycle is condensation, right? So condensation is when water is moving from the gas state to the liquid state. And then precipitation is when that water is then returning to the Earth's surface, falling as, right, sleet, snow, rain. So we see this all the time in clouds, right? So water evaporates, goes up into the atmosphere, it condenses in a cloud, and eventually it becomes too heavy, and that's when it falls down in liquid form as precipitation. And once it falls as precipitation, this could cause surface runoff. It's another way that water moves around, right? And we also depend on that falling water to kind of percolate through the soil and recharge groundwater or aquifers, right? And I think we talked about in a previous class how water percolating through the soil is actually an ecosystem service, because it's probably purifying the water of larger pollutants as it moves through that soil. However, a large portion of Earth's water is present in the oceans, and it's not necessarily as useful to us if it's in a saltwater form. A very small portion of Earth's water is actually usable to us in the form of fresh water. That is why, as we're seeing increased warming, right, increased climate change, and we're seeing a freshwater glacier or ice caps start to melt, and that fresh water, say as it's melting, is beginning to mix with ocean water, we're actually losing more access to fresh water, right? Because it's mixing with the salt water, and then we have to depend on slower processes such as the evaporation. So as the water heats the oceans, right? It's not like when the fresh water mixes with the salt water, we're never going to see that fresh water again necessarily, but it very much slows down the rate at which we get that fresh water back. So as evaporation is happening, as it gets warm, that salt is not going to rise up into the atmosphere, okay? But the water is. So that fresh water slowly recycles from the ocean over time, but the more you have mixing, the more you complicate that process. There's just a diagram here showing the natural hydrologic cycle process, and the red are showing the human impacts that we have on each step of this cycle. So humans, right, whether it be in industry or in our household, everyday lives, we contribute to water pollution. all of us in this class have likely contributed to water pollution in one way or the other. So we can contribute to water pollution when it's in its liquid form of the hydrologic cycle, right? Another important aspect of a negative human impact would be increasing runoff. How do we increase runoff? If we are, say, clear-cutting forests, we contribute to runoff because we remove the deep root systems. Root systems in not only trees, but other plant matter, they anchor the soil in place in a sense. So as we have excess removal of trees and other plant matter, the next time that we get a heavy rain, you'll actually lose a lot more of the soil in runoff, and that also can contribute to water pollution. Why? Because a lot of the nitrogen and phosphorus nutrients that are found in soil in really high amounts, they're actually pollutants to water. That's why algal blooms are such a large problem. It's because you have like fertilizer runoff. Fertilizer is very rich in nutrients, and it pumps all those nutrients into the water. Organisms rapidly eat them, form an algal bloom, and then we have a deoxygenated natural environment, right? The other thing is overpumping of aquifers. So you can think of an aquifer as like an underground fresh water source in a way. So if you drill a well down into an aquifer, right, say to get drinking water, if you are pulling from that aquifer faster than it can recharge by the groundwater percolation process, you are exploiting that natural resource beyond its yield, right? So you're overpumping the aquifer. That's a common human impact of freshwater sources. So here we've just got a summary slide of human impacts to the water cycle. Moving on to the carbon cycle. So atmospheric carbon dioxide, a key component of the carbon cycle, has a significant temperature impact via the greenhouse effect. So you'll remember slides ago, I was talking about how if you get more of those greenhouse gases concentrated in the atmosphere, they have an affinity for heat, and that's what causes that gradual increase in Earth's temperature over time, or part of the phenomenon that we refer to as climate change. So carbon dioxide is one of those greenhouse gases. So it's important that when we're thinking about the carbon cycle, we're thinking about how human activity in particular increases the amount of carbon dioxide. How is carbon being cycled throughout the biosphere? In some of the processes that we've actually already talked about. So either photosynthesis by producers. Remember we said that plant matter captures carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and in return puts out glucose and oxygen. And then we've got kind of the other process that sort of undoes photosynthesis. And that's aerobic respiration. And that's done not only by plants, but also by consumers and decomposers. So we've got a lot of these arrow diagrams again. The book has quite a few of these. So what gives off excess carbon dioxide? So what of human activity is really pushing forward the exacerbation of climate change? That would be burning fossil fuels. Transportation, right? Your car is giving off not only carbon dioxide as it's burning gas, it's also giving off nitrous oxides, but we'll save that for another slide. Deforestation. Why would deforestation be releasing carbon dioxide? So as we said, trees almost act as a carbon capture technology. So they're taking that carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to do photosynthesis with. So they're actually storing up a lot of carbon. And as you cut down a tree and say a tree starts to maybe not decompose, but over time, more carbon gases are released from the wood and then going back into the atmosphere. Another large impact on carbon dioxide levels would be forest fires. So catastrophic in other ways, yes, but they also contribute heavily to overloading the atmosphere with carbon dioxide. And we're seeing forest fires at higher rates than ever, right? It always seems like on the news you're seeing another huge forest fire, particularly out west, where they may have just very dense forests that haven't been cut in a long time, along with just very, very hot climates. So humans alter the carbon cycle, just to recap here, by extracting and burning fossil fuels at a much higher rate than they are naturally formed, and by clearing forests faster than they can regrow. And this destroys that carbon-absorbing vegetation that we talked about. All right, so that was the carbon cycle in a nutshell. Then talking about the nitrogen cycle, and bacteria play a really important role in the nitrogen cycle. So to start out, kind of set the stage here, atmospheric nitrogen, which is a really common form of nitrogen, it's actually N2. So two nitrogen atoms bound together make atmospheric nitrogen. But that's not a very usable form of nitrogen by most organisms. So it actually has to be converted into ammonia and then converted into nitrates and nitrites. And that process is driven by bacteria. So bacteria convert the nitrogen into that usable form, and then plants are able to uptake ammonia and nitrates in order to grow. Consumers, which we said, they're not making their own food, they're consuming other organisms to get their energy input. So we're talking about herbivores in particular. And decomposers will convert the nitrogen back into nitrogen gas. So it's really, that's why we call it a cycle here, because we've got the bacteria converting the nitrogen, the atmospheric nitrogen, into the more usable form. And then as consumers and decomposers kind of uptake the usable form, they actually convert it back into nitrogen gas, which is the unusable form. So pretty cyclic in nature here. What we've got here, so I'm showing, maybe you can see with my mouse, I've got the N2 right here, that's the atmospheric nitrogen. Bacteria then fix that nitrogen into the ammonia here, the NH3, and then further processes in nitrogen fixation convert it into nitrite and nitrate. So nitrite being NO2, nitrate being NO3. So this is really important because ammonia is a very important plant nutrient. And so if we didn't have these nitrogen fixing bacteria really concentrated in some types of plants, we would be seeing nitrogen as a really limiting plant nutrient. So how might human impacts be throwing off not only the carbon cycle, but here also the nitrogen cycle? So as you heard me saying, when you're driving a car, you're actually giving off nitrogen oxides. Those result from incomplete combustion of the gasoline. Nitrogen oxides are released into the atmosphere and can actually be a contributor to acid rain. So if those nitrogen oxides and sulfur, I think sulfur oxides as well, as those form with water vapor, the next time that cloud condenses and the water gets too heavy and it falls as precipitation, that rain would be more acidic in nature, right? So we can be throwing off the nitrogen cycle by contributing way too heavily to nitrogen oxides. Another thing we could be doing, I know we talked about synthetic fertilizers before. And while synthetic fertilizers are considered a pretty important development, right, being able to supplement maybe nutrient poor soil with the objective of allowing more crops to grow if you apply fertilizer, applying those fertilizers in excess can be pretty bad for the environment in a couple ways. So one, it can also give off these nitrogen oxides that we just talked about. But two, the runoff. So if we're talking about runoff of nitrates, like say you get a heavy rain, say you apply excess fertilizer before a heavy rain, and that cropland sits near a body of water, you'll actually see the runoff of that nitrogen, and then you're kind of again over polluting that body of water with nutrient input that then contributes to algal blooms. So those are the two ways that we're really seeing human impact, and it's via the incomplete combustion of gasoline, like when driving our cars, and also from overuse of synthetic fertilizers, and then having those run off into bodies of water. And we've got a nice summary of those impacts here, if you'd rather read the words than look at the diagram. The last cycle that we're going to talk about today is a bit more like lesser known, I would say, but it's the phosphorus cycle. So phosphorus is a little different. It cycles through soils, water, and plants, but it doesn't cycle through the atmosphere. So the nitrogen and the carbon cycle through the atmosphere in some sense, right? If they're in gas form, but the phosphorus cycle doesn't do that. Phosphorus can be temporarily reduced or removed from the natural cycling process if it's washed into oceans and ends up trapped in marine sediments. How does it end up there? How does it end up washed out into the ocean? It's similar to the nitrogen runoff that we just talked about. So soil fertilizer does not just have nitrogen in it. Usually fertilizer has three really heavy components to it. It's the nitrogen, the phosphorus, and the potassium. And they're put in different ratios depending on what the, like, we try to find the most optimal ratio of those for plants to grow. So there is phosphorus also in those fertilizers. And so as, like we just said, if there's, say, a heavy rain and you're applying way too much fertilizer, you're going to end up with an excess amount of phosphorus washing into nearby bodies of water. And it's not just soil runoff here that's important. This can also be from sewage plants. So human sewage, right, also has nutrient content, and it might have phosphates as well. So if you're releasing, say, wastewater effluent into a body of water, you could also be contributing to that nutrient overloading, right, with the phosphates. Not only wastewater effluent, but also in mining waste. So remember we talked about how the phosphorus cycle, a lot of that phosphorus is trapped up in rocks and minerals. So if you are mining and you release the waste of that, you could be releasing phosphorus again into unwanted areas where it's sort of trapped. So those are kind of the three main components of how humans are impacting this process. It's because of our fertilizer runoff, our wastewater effluent or our sewage runoff, and also an irresponsible dumping of mining waste. And then again, we've got this word summary slide here if you would like to refer to it later. So those were our cycles we needed to get through. So just remember to know the basic ins and outs of the hydrologic cycle, the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, and know a little bit about the phosphorus cycle. Our last couple slides here are just talking about, now that we've talked about these components of the ecosystem, how do scientists study ecosystems? They can do this by either field and laboratory research, by designing controlled experiments, or by developing mathematical and statistical models based off a sample data set. So one interesting phenomenon that we see in field research here, this water that looks almost like a pinkish purple, this is a field scientist studying purple sulfur bacteria. So basically bacteria that are conducting photosynthesis in an alternate way, and it causes this pink purple appearance to the water. This is something that people study in the field and maybe in the laboratory, but mostly in the field. Some things are better studied in the field, some are better studied in the laboratory. If it's very difficult to conduct field research all the time to study this, right? You might want to develop a mathematical or statistical model to form predictions based on data that was already collected, so you're not constantly having to collect new data. So yeah, some people, depending on the subject of study, they want to study nature directly. So they want to make direct observations and take measurements of ecosystems in the field. Another mechanism of studying the environment could be flying over ecosystems to photograph them. I've got an example of that in the next slide. If you're into wildlife research, they use radio transmitters and remote sensing to track organisms. So you might be tracking how a population of a certain species, tracking their migration habits. They might do that with remote sensing techniques. And then in situations where it's really difficult to constantly collect data on a particular subject of study, and you want to make more predictive projections of that, again, you might create the mathematical model. So for instance, climate change, like where we get the projections of when we see ecological tipping points going to occur, we might try to take sample data about carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, what the levels look like in, parts per million, and then kind of project that out. If we keep continuing burning fossil fuels at this rate, what will those levels look like, say in 10, 20 years, So mathematical models are also used to project into the future. So one example of flying over an ecosystem to look at it and photograph it, this is forward-looking infrared imagery. So what this is used for is basically to fly over a forested piece of land and depict different species and to find with the red where the dead trees are. So this was used in emerald ash borer studies to fly over land that was predominated with ash to see roughly what percentage of the surface area of the forest was dead due to this emerald ash borer insect. And if you remember, we talked about mechanisms by which that little emerald bug is kind of transmitted, and it's started in the US because of shipping pallets that were brought from overseas, and then it was further proliferated from the movement of firewood. So a piece of contaminated wood, say, is carried from campsite to campsite, state to state, and now we've got this really prolific impact of emerald ash borer that's killed millions of ash trees, right? But this is one mechanism, because going out and counting each ash tree that is dead due to emerald ash borer maybe isn't feasible, right? If we're talking about a huge sample size. So you can actually use this remote sensing technique to kind of gather what percentage of the cover is dead. For those other topics that may not be feasible to always study in the field, we might set up controlled laboratory experiments to study them. How do you do that? With culture tubes, aquariums, greenhouses are a great example. And you might have, especially with plant studies, you could have indoor and outdoor chambers where you can control certain variables such as light, temperature, water input. You could even track the respiration and photosynthesis photosynthesis rates of those plants with special equipment. What are the pros of doing a controlled experiment in a lab? So if you have a small experiment and you're just trying to measure specific variables, you can save money and it might be much faster to carry out than if you're studying the environment directly. A con, though, is that some environments can be very complex. And so really trying to replicate all those abiotic and biotic factors that may be impacting your variables, all those variables, you might not be able to recreate reality well enough in a lab environment. So there's pros and cons to not doing the study directly, but depending on, the parameters of what you're looking for, it might be feasible. Okay. If we're taking something away from this ecosystem talk, these 3 points may be a useful summary point. Life is sustained by the flow of energy and nutrients through ecosystems, and they're continually recycled. We saw that in several instances, not only with the food web, right, but with each of those 4 cycles we talked about. Ecosystems are characterized by producers, which create their own food, right? They're autotrophs. Consumers, which consume other organisms for energy input, and decomposers, which may either feed on dead organisms or dead organic matter. All of those role players there aid in the cycling process. And then, like several components of this class, we talk about how human activity impacts those ecosystem cycles, and we have a summary slide for each type of cycle detailing those human impacts. So yeah, thank you for watching this lecture on chapter 3, and I will talk to you next week.